Hello, my name is Lynnette Marrero, and I'm one of the co-founders of SpeedRock. And this is the evolution of women behind bars, a spirited account of barmaids, dames, and broads. This is the part of our She Persisted Women's History Month initiative that is sponsored by Branca USA. And we wanted to make sure that this month we were highlighting different issues affecting women today. And we did not want to exclude our history and how we came to be a part of the food and beverage and hospitality scene. So in this seminar presented by myself, Kirsten Amann, Meaghan Dorman, and Misty Kalkofen with Lauren Paylor. We've actually been presenting this seminar since 2014. LP is here as part of our SpeedRock coordinator for social, but also as a content creator. And we wanted to kind of talk about how this seminar has evolved. So you'll see from our first presentations, if you've seen it before, we've been evolving this discussion, finding more names of women who impacted hospitality and spirits. But more importantly, we have also learned to listen to the silence and look at the gaps in information to better understand the full picture of what is going on. So these are some women who have paved the path, and we'll take you on this spirited journey, chronicling the history, the women pioneers in the bartending community. And some, you may not know some of their names, but their battles and their hard work are what kept spirits flowing.
Thank you, Lynnette. So while there is much discussion, especially in this month, surrounding the lack of representation for women in spirits, in brewing, and in wine, as our research has taught us, we've actually been involved since the very beginning in all of these trades. Sumerian women, in fact, were the first brewers. The goddess Ninkasi was actually a Sumerian deity who was worshipped as the goddess of beer. Beer was very important and part of the culture and daily life in Sumeria. It was used for religious rituals, for medicine, and often in place of drinking water as a safer drinking alternative. And of course, it was enjoyed as a party beverage. While women were there in the beginning, as the brewing operations shifted from a cottage industry into commercial production, we see men starting to take over and helm those operations. Many of the ancient depictions, for example, show women at the helm of brewing, both in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. But later images show men supervising female brewers, so moving over into positions of authority. Women were also there in the beginning with chemistry, alchemy, and distillation. The first distiller was believed to be a woman named Taputi Beletakilam. She was from Babylon, and she was a noblewoman who was also a very important perfume maker. She's believed to have used the first recorded still in history, and all this info about her we found written on a cuneiform tablet dated 1200 BCE. Many of the early chemists were in fact women, first actually working as alchemists, so trying to make gold. Maria Hebrea, or Maria the Jewess, you can see pictured here. She was a very important first century alchemist. She developed the double boiler, or the bain-marie, which you might know from cooking or from working in restaurants. And she was also very influential in developing the alembic still. Popping forward into the Middle Ages, we see women continuing the traditions of alchemy and working as apothecaries, with many of their distillates designed for health and to actually cure people, so whatever ailed people, kind of like creating the aspirin of the Middle Ages. Women would eventually become demonized for this work, with the creation of distillates and potions being linked to witchcraft. And a staggering fact, between 50,000 and 80,000 people were murdered in Europe for witchcraft between 1500 and 1660. Of those people murdered, 80% were women. Very, very sad. So popping over to late medieval England, early colonial American drinking traditions are very informed by England, right, as we were an English colony to start. In late medieval England, women actually dominated the drink trade. Operation of a modest public house was seen as an extension of the domestic duties and roles of women in private houses. So whereas in your private house, you would provide food, obviously lodging, a drink for your family, you could create a public iteration where you would do those same things for folks who were not part of your family. So people who were strangers or parts of the public. They provided drinks and lodging, and this could easily become part of the routine of the domestic economy in this period. Many of the licenses held by men likely masked operations that were managed by their wives and daughters. Within some cases, alehouses were actually a second business for their families. Women were at the helm while their husbands pursued their trade, so getting second income. And there were actually ballads that were written that extolled how economically valuable an attractive wife could be for business. To quote one, she welcomed guests, plied them with liquor, and kept them happy with smiles, kisses, and sometimes intimate favors. Nevertheless, these wives developed reputations as shrewd business people in late medieval England. So popping over across the pond to the Colonial Tavern, let's understand the 17th century Colonial Tavern, what that looked like and felt like. So first we have to address the fact that colonial America was a very boozy place. Colonists of every rank, size, and age, including children, drank often and in great quantity. The annual per capita consumption of hard liquor alone was 4 gallons a head, and that figure does not include beer, wine, or the copiously consumed hard cider. Women did in fact drink in this period, occasionally to excess, but they usually consumed alcohol in private, and an inebriated woman was considered a private affair if it was of concern at all. Just like in Sumeria, alcohol in America was considered a safer alternative to water, so as such it became a staple of the colonial diet as well. And Puritan women in the Massachusetts Bay Colony often incorporated brewing into their household routines, so along with tasks like baking bread. Often one of the first additions to the Puritan home would be a brew house or an ale house. And from this, the first known taverns and ordinaries evolved from these public houses. The primary function of the public house was to accommodate travelers, and they also went on to become important meeting spaces, sort of locuses and places of gathering for the town, for the colonial town. It was a place where news was disseminated. It was certainly a center of public life. It was a place where you could gather around a warm fire, get a hot meal. And these spaces went on to become a very important network of communication that was vital to the American Revolution. So just to share some early colonial drinking habits, as you can see, some very big spikes prior to like the mid 1800s. And then this is always fun to look at. This is a menu from a minister's ordination ceremony, or maybe it's a receipt. Before the ceremony, the 80 guests had 30 bowls of punch. At dinner, there were 68 guests who had 44 bowls of punch, 18 bottles of wine, 8 bowls of brandy, and an unspecified quantity of cherry rum. Sounds like quite a party. But certainly looking at the Colonial Tavern, the tavern was a gendered space. When a man entered a tavern, it was a distinctly male preserve where he could expect to be away from wife and home concerns. The tavern was considered a place to meet, talk, work, and relax, just answering to other men. Women were not legally barred from the tavern, but women from middling and elite strata patronized the tavern only rarely. And generally doing so was believed to risk damaging their reputations. While there are laws that govern taverns and drinking, they barely mention women at all, but they do implicate women in laws that are aimed to prevent individuals from meeting at taverns or houses of ill repute to engage in illicit sex. If women partook of tavern services at all, the proprietors and patrons usually assumed that they were either the wives or servants or sex workers that were serving the men that they accompanied. So a woman might go to a tavern while traveling, for example, but respectable women prefer to avoid the discomforts of the tavern as risking their reputations by being seen there. Some taverns also had a women's parlor, which was a totally separate space from the tap room with a fireplace and a more genteel atmosphere. But that being said, if women did stay at a tavern while traveling, it was often only after exhausting all other lodging options. Keeping women out of the tavern was very consistent with society's insistence that good wives fulfill their duties to husbands and children by remaining at their labors rather than squandering time drinking. So building a home, caretaking versus going out and partying. That said, many of the ordinaries that women did frequent tended to be lower class establishments. They catered to mixed gender and mixed race crowds, and they were often ran the risk of being identified by local officials as disorderly, which we'll talk about more in a moment. So in most early colonies, women were not legally permitted to own or operate a tavern. And this is because the laws defined husband and wife as one entity. In Massachusetts, for example, women could not own or acquire property or enter into a contract or write a will. Women, if they did work in taverns, they were working alongside their husbands and their fathers. And they certainly did not participate in the sociability of the house. So they were there to serve, not to be seen or heard, and they were not part of the culture of drinking at all. But that being said, what if a woman's husband or her main source of income died? Operating a tavern could become a means for a woman to support herself in Massachusetts and in many colonies. And while this contradicted the order of Puritan society, like at its base, because tavern owners were supposed to be responsible and capable of serving guests enough alcohol to satisfy them, but still to be able to control the guests who were drinking, which would have been men. It was a great violation of the patriarchal structure of Puritan society. But Puritan leaders would, on a case-by-case, allow for licenses to be granted to these widows as an alternative to putting them on public assistance. This would allow them to support themselves and their families and keep them off the dole, basically. As widowed tavern owners, women maintained a notable presence as proprietors in the colonies. They held almost half of the 45 licenses in existence in Boston in 1690. In 1696, they presided over 1/3 of the 75 taverns in Boston. And they maintained a notable presence as tavern owners in Philadelphia in the 18th century. Down in Charleston, South Carolina, female tavern keepers actually outnumbered men in all but one of the 15 years preceding the American Revolution. And they were responsible for all sorts of diverse public houses. South Carolina is a little bit of a different story than the northern colonies. Most of the women who sold, drank, or operated taverns in Philadelphia and New York were either in Boston were either single or widowed. But in Charleston, while some women inherited the businesses from their deceased husbands, far more of the city's female publicans were actually married. In the South, married women were allowed to own businesses, and many owned taverns. This is because a portion of the South Carolina population represented the wealthiest colonists in North America. So colonial lawmakers there designed laws that could guard that wealth in specific acts designed to protect women. South Carolina thus held liberal standards for femme covert businesswomen. So femme covert is that describes a woman who's married. So they had liberal standards for these businesswomen, and they allowed them to actually separate their earnings from their husbands. In some cases, in many cases, actually, there were prenuptial agreements that were created and honored to protect women's assets in marriage, and many women had them. For female residents of South Carolina, the sole trader status was available to any woman, so whether she was married, widowed, or single. And South Carolina wives were very actively engaged in the family business and achieved a measure of autonomy long before other colonial women. Very interesting. Disorderly houses. So what were these? The types of taverns women owned were unfortunately not usually considered the best taverns. They were not typically described as genteel places with good entertainment. And once a woman did own a tavern, her fate as tavern keeper was never fully fixed. Licensing, an example for Massachusetts, was very subjective. Requests for renewal could be easily denied year over year for a variety of reasons. One would be disorderliness. Also, if it was the site of drunkenness, the tavern, or if the tavern mocked religious teachings. Women in general were more prone to being named proprietors of disorderly houses. This could be for a few reasons. So possibly this is because men drank with less restraint in them. It could be because a select men simply wanted to take a license away from a woman tavern keeper and give it to his buddy who wanted a tavern. And then women were also generally assumed incapable of commanding men to behave properly. So there was a strong bias there that led to a higher incidence of women and women's taverns being declared disorderly. When a woman did remarry, her license did not travel with her in most colonies. So some interesting facts about that, from 1702 to 1732, only 1/3 of female tavern keepers in Massachusetts actually took new husbands while they held their licenses. Of those who did remarry, almost all made it clear that they wanted to stay in the drink trade and went ahead and made their husbands apply for those new licenses anyway. So very interesting. So our four broads, what were they like? What were these tavern keeping gals like? So much like English alewives of yesteryear, female colonial tavern owners had to be shrewd business people. They faced fierce competition and were more vulnerable to rival tavern keepers that were interested in stealing their trade. They definitely had to hustle for more business and outmaneuver their male counterparts. And they bargained closely in face-to-face deals with men who might resent them, people who would have disliked their assertiveness and potentially would have retaliated. As such, they challenged the colonial gender roles. They were working in a cutthroat trade and stepped out of their customary dependent roles that women were expected to occupy in this period. So early American women behind bars to raise a glass to today. We know Deborah Mann was the most successful retailer in Boston in the 1710s. We know Rebecca Holmes presided over the important and famous Bunch of Grapes Tavern in Boston. The Bunch of Grapes was known as the best punch house in Boston, and it later became an important hangout spot for the Sons of Liberty and a hotbed for political activism in Boston. Frances Wardell was a darling of the Superior Court in Massachusetts. She was courted by many men seeking a wife with property, and she never remarried. And then, of course, our favorite, we have Alice Guest from Philadelphia and Jane Casnow from Boston. So Alice Guest, Alice and her husband George emigrated from England to Philadelphia in 1683. When they moved, George set up a brick works on a less than desirable swath of land on the banks of the Delaware River. I have an early map here that shows approximately where those caves would have been. So if you look down at the bottom right side. When George died in 1685, Alice applied for a license to operate a tavern, as many women would have, as a way to support herself. And the locale she chose was her cave. She lived there. She occupied that cave on the banks of the river. She was one of many of the earliest Philadelphia urbanites who arrived in the city that William Penn was planning before homes were actually built for them. So these pioneering Quakers braved the weather in man-made caves dug into the banks of the Delaware River. They knew this land would be valuable, which is why they moved into them, and they were hoping to secure it for future, so like finders keepers style. Here's another picture of the caves, which I found, which looks cool. So Alice's dwelling indicates that she was of meager means at first, but she quickly turned her fortune around. Her cave was ideally positioned to provide tavern services to the increasingly large number of immigrants that were pouring into the country by ship. And she also captured the business of men employed in the sea trades, so mariners, merchants, chandlers, and ship carpenters. The area also became, I should say, the site of many other disorderly houses, but not the Crooked Billet, which is the tavern that Alice ran. During her first years in business, Alice amassed enough money to put a bond on her business. And when the city of Philadelphia moved to evict all the cave dwellers from the banks of the river, Alice was among a few exceptions who was allowed to stay. She certainly could have moved her tavern business at this time. She had enough wealth amassed, but she chose to stay in her cave. Most likely this was because she had a solid reputation there and served a regular clientele. And just to editorialize a little bit, I think she probably chose to stay in her cave because it was a unique place for her guests to sip their punch. By the time she died in 1693, Alice had received a patent to her land, built a structure to house her tavern, erected a wharf out from her riverfront. Along the wharf, she had also constructed a warehouse and a dwelling, and she had acquired another residence. So cheers to Alice and her booming cave-dwelling Philadelphia tavern. Moving on to Jane Casnow in Boston. So Jane Casnow also gives us a good example of how we know what we know about colonial women in the bar. So in Boston during the Revolutionary period, as we've established, female tavern keepers were quite ubiquitous. Jane herself operated the Sun Tavern, which was a large tavern in bustling Dock Square, right across from Faneuil Hall, which is the birthplace of the Revolution. If you've ever been to Boston, you've probably been there on a tour. That said, all the info that we have on Jane is from probate records and other court documents. There are newspaper articles and advertisements about the men in her life that give us some information. So her husband, Peace, her landlord, Joseph Jackson, her son-in-law, Edward Jackson, her purveyors, and her father and brother, both who are named Jonathan Rouse. But the rest of our understanding comes just from learning typical patterns of female entrepreneurship in colonial era Boston. So Jane Casno was cool. She was at once a typical tavern-keeping woman and a distinctive one. Typically, she was a working widow who straddled the border between laboring and middling economic status. She was not financially destitute, but she had no children. And the records about Jane speak to economic and personal hardships versus specific skills or abilities to run a tavern. So the implication is that she needed the money, needed the work, versus something like she was this amazing bartender or tavern owner. But she was also an atypical female petitioner as well. She omits the sordid details of need when she's petitioning to keep her license. This was perhaps to afford herself the privacy and dignity afford herself privacy and dignity. It could also be to indicate that she was herself a self-sufficient entrepreneur. Women like Jane were highly mobile and visible in revolutionary Boston. They interacted daily and purchased from merchants and shopkeepers, both male and female, in colonial Boston. And she also maintained a steady clientele of local and non-local men from different economic backgrounds. So from dock workers to seamen to merchants to town selectmen. And looking at a little floor plan for her tavern, the Sun Tavern was actually quite a large property. It faced Faneuil Hall's marketplace, like we've already said, which was the birthplace of American Revolution. Keeping all this in mind, it would be misleading to conceive of the drink trade as a liberating outlet for women in this period. It was not a means of transcending gender roles in Massachusetts, for example, at all. And for most women, remarrying often proved to be an easier way to make ends meet for them. So what of Republican motherhood? Republican motherhood and the cult of true womanhood is something that was evolving during the Revolutionary era and certainly after. The American Revolution shifted the responsibility of the moral condition of the state from the monarch to we the people. So the concept of Republican motherhood emerges definitely post-war. And in this period, the idea of raising children to become good citizens became the political contribution of good Republican mothers to the new republic. Women would become the nurturers and instructors of virtuous Republican citizens in the home, as well as the architects of a new domesticity. It was believed that Republican mothers could instruct their children, their sons especially, to be intelligent and reasonable individuals. And that if the Republic were to succeed, women must be schooled in virtue so they could teach their children. And this actually led to the founding of the first American female academies in the 1790s. And a new commitment to female education helped make husbands and wives more equal within the family. As part of this, the new cult of domesticity emerged, and it was everywhere in popular culture, from magazines to newspapers to fiction books. This whole concept of women having to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. Women, as such, were expected to make the home a special place, so something that could be a refuge from the world at large for the husband. Husbands were expected to be able to escape from the highly competitive, unstable, immoral world of business and industry. People really generally then believed that in order for men to succeed in the work world, they had to be materialistic, aggressive, vulgar, hard, and rational. And at home, they could develop another side to their nature. So a human, anti-competitive side with humanistic values, ascetic values, love, honor, loyalty, and faithfulness. Tall order. But creating a private life of domestic bliss was also believed to require purchasing material luxuries. And this placed new pressures on men to reduce spending on drink. This new role gradually invested Republican mothers with the authority to criticize the tavern haunting drinking habits of their husbands. And in this period, we also see women starting to form voluntary societies. This was so that they could enhance their ability to administer and promote domestic felicity in their own homes and the homes of the poor. And this is also when women started to organize to cultivate domesticity along Republican lines. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to LP. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Kitty. You know, and speaking of education and really understanding our history, I really wanted to touch on the importance of understanding the historical context associated with the topics that we discuss. So today I'm going to talk about the role of alcohol in conjunction with African Americans and how it was utilized in many different ways, how it influenced them in many different ways. So to start, we will discuss the role of alcohol in the slave trade. So historians have long believed that alcohol played a central role in the 18th century's triangular slave trade. Ships loaded with American rum traveled to the Gulf Coast of Africa, then left with human cargo bound for the West Indies. There, slaves were traded for the sugar and molasses that would return to New England for the production of more rum and preparation for the next trip to Africa. In 1773, traders could buy a slave in Africa for 140 to 160 gallons of rum. Some modern historians have begun to question the extent of this trading pattern. Alcohol sometimes played a pretty extensive role in the slave trade. So the reason I wanted to bring this up, because I think it's important to understand like how this starts. And you know, as we further explore this topic, you'll see how the relationship changes over time. So in general, slaves brought to the Americas were either captured or purchased in extensive slave trade that existed within Africa. Africans became slaves in their own countries because of their debts, because they were captured in war, or as punishment for breaking laws. All right. So one of the things we're going to talk about here is women's roles in conjunction with African culture and alcohol. So most African people brought to America as slaves came from West African cultures, in which alcohol had been available and used since antiquity. Alcoholic beverages, beer and wines, were blended into the economic, social, and religious customs of the non-Islamic African cultures. Highly defined rituals and traditions served to minimize problems. In these cultures, drinking in moderation was encouraged, while drunkenness and other socially disruptive behaviors were strongly tabooed. In spite of the fact that they had been torn from their cultural roots, African slaves brought to the new land many of their attitudes and rituals concerning alcohol. In the early years of their arrival, Blacks were generally very moderate with drinking. All right, so Africans have been imbibing and making alcoholic beverages from a wide array of fruits, grains, and other natural substances for as far back as the historical record goes, and continue to do so, ranging from palm wine in coastal West and East Africa to banana beer in the Great Lake regions to mead in Ethiopia and maize sorghum beer across southern Africa. Fermented drinks have typically been a source of vital nutrients, but at the same time, they have inscribed social hierarchies based on a combination of political precedents, gender, and generation. So women in relation to this, a lot of the alcohol, in fact, much of the alcohol was often made by women, but it was senior men who typically defined who could drink, how much, and in what context, which places this into to great perspective as to what women's roles were, right? All right. Alcohol and other drug use by slaves, as well as domestic medicine, is really what we will lean into and discuss here. So the slaves had only limited contact with other psychoactive drugs. They occasionally chewed, sniffed, and smoked tobacco, but there's little evidence that they took advantage of psychoactive properties of things like hemp that were grown commercially. Slaves had little access to medicines of the day. And, you know, a lot of the medicine they utilized was not access for regular mood alteration, which is important to note. The slaves' illnesses and injuries were often ignored by their owners or treated with patent medicines. And women were often the caretakers, so a lot of this is knowledge that they had to have in their back pockets. There were many different factors that led to the effectiveness of African American slave medicine during the early to mid 19th century United States, or the antebellum period. African slaves who were taken away from their native lands carried with them their own native medical practices and knowledge. Their pre-established medical knowledge would grow over time as countless generations of African Americans would soon be exposed to the medical cultures of both Native Americans and white European immigrants. And this is really important to acknowledge and remember, because they brought a lot of customs with them from Africa to the United States. And as they realized some remedies just weren't working, their customs became a lot more westernized and influenced based on what did work. And in many instances, their medicine was way, way, way more advanced than what they were seeing, which is quite interesting and very cool. All right. The next thing we're going to discuss is alcohol as a tool of oppression. And unfortunately, this is something that we saw occurring a lot during this period of time. So alcohol was sometimes used by slave owners deliberately as a tool of control and manipulation. It was a regular part of seasonal celebrations. Masters often rewarded slaves in whiskey to motivate them to work harder during harvest time. The harvest time ritual represented a blending of African and European cultures, but it also served as a means of control. This use of alcohol as a tool of manipulation had been carried to the colonies from the West Indies. American slaves took part in house and church raisings and in other social festivities in which alcohol was served. Slaves were not allowed to work on those days between Christmas and New Year's, and they were often encouraged to become drunk. And it's interesting because a lot of this was really in order to ensure that they wouldn't be able to plot their escapes when they had this downtime. That is why they were encouraged to drink heavily. So one way in which planters and overseers encouraged drunkenness was their sponsorship of drinking contests among the slaves. And Frederick Douglass actually notes this in his autobiography. It was often frowned upon to not be intoxicated or drunk during these moments of celebration. So when we're speaking specifically about women in this role, enslaved women were counted on not only to do their housework and fieldwork, but also to bear, nourish, and rear the children whom slave holders sought to continually replenish their labor force. As house slaves, women were domestic servants, cooking, sewing, acting as maids, and rearing the planters' children. The experience of women runaways has been marginalized or ignored altogether in the history of slavery overall. Consequently, the role the slave women played in their home communities has become mythologized as the strong but passive mother, giving over to male slaves the role of active resistor and potential insurrectionist. So the threat of sale, or the threat and reality of sale and separation, whipping, and other forms of punishment, as well as sexual exploitation, were among the motivations that drove women to run away. While abolitionists in the Black community valorized the run to freedom in the North, especially for men, the majority of women who ran away stayed within the state. So I really just wanted to touch on this to provide a bit of perspective, but it's quite an interesting lens. All right, so one thing that's important to note during this time is that, unfortunately, with the lack of documentation, we cannot associate a lot of names that are essentially the people who have provided us with these pivotal moments. And it's pretty sad. So when we do have the names of individuals, we want to be able to celebrate them and really discuss them. So Carolyn Burnham is one of those people. And when we think of slavery and we think of this period of time, we often forget, that mindset that they had to keep. They were caretakers. They led their lives with hospitality and service, and they were really damn good at their jobs. So in June 1796, George Washington sent instructions to his farm manager, William Pierce, for preparing the Mount Vernon mansion for the family's arrival from Philadelphia. He told Pierce to have the rooms in the servants' hall cleaned and the beds put in order, to attach a lock on the door, and to order Caroline or whoever has the charge of the rooms to suffer no person asleep or even to go into it without express orders from her mistress or myself. Washington's reference to the enslaved housemaid Carolyn Burnham illuminates the role she played in cleaning, maintaining, and protecting the rooms of the mansion and its associated structures. Caroline, Molly, Charlotte, and other enslaved housemaids faced the relentless cycle of domestic work, lighting fires, making beds, washing clothes and linens, sweeping and scrubbing floors, and dusting furniture, scrubbing and polishing silverware, amongst many other duties. Miss Caroline worked 18 hours a day, and polishing silverware was the only time noted that she had time to herself. So this is interesting because when we think of hospitality and service, we think of the food and beverage industry, we often forget all of the things that lead up to the end result, the food and the drink. But think about how many times when you work at Michelin-starred restaurants or just restaurants in general, you have to light the hearth, you have to polish the silverware, you have to wash the linens. These are all the little details, the finer details are what make the overall experience that much more enjoyable. So again, when we have the names of individuals who really have paved the way, it's really important to acknowledge them. And this story is quite amazing because clearly she was very much placed in a position where her work was acknowledged. Her hard work was acknowledged. All right. And then the next story I wanted to talk about or touch on is Emmeline Jones. So Emmeline Jones from the mid-19th century is said to have created the Saratoga chip. She's a woman that many should remember. According to the 1860 census for Baltimore, an Emmeline Johns appears as a free slave. And this is, again, important to note because but the way that people's names were documented, many names we can't even discover. This right here is really, really just serves as proof that that documentation was sometimes inaccurate, right? Emmeline Jones started as a house servant and developed a reputation amongst many for delicious cuisines and her extravagant multi-course meals. Making her way to New York area, she settled in Manhattan and built a reputable catering business. She was admired by many and even offered jobs from Presidents Arthur and Cleveland, who sampled her meals when she worked at clubs in New York in the late 1800s. It is stated that they had both offered her a big salary to work at the White House to be the chef, but she turned down their offers. She was famous for her terrapin stew. Before emancipation, turtles were actually extremely abundant in the Atlantic coast and were considered a slave food. It's kind of funny because we think this is very similar to lobster, and we see when we look at history, and you know, we think of lobster as a very luxurious food item. So they were easy to catch and rich in protein. And her story would have gone unknown had it not been documented in newspaper articles and obituaries which celebrate her life. Her obituary even mentions a number of New York chefs who apprenticed under her, which is quite interesting. All right. And now I pass the baton over. Thanks for spending some time with me, y'all. Bye.
Thanks, LP. That was awesome to learn about Mrs. Emmeline Jones. I wasn't familiar with her, so I'm super excited to read more about her and about her Saratoga chips. I'm going to take us from kind of the middle 1800s into the early 1900s. And during this time period, there were three primary influences on women in drinking spaces. And those were the Industrial Revolution, the temperance movement, and what David Wondrich calls the rise of the fancy drinks. So let's start with the Industrial Revolution. So prior to 1850, most people were working in trade workshops. So you would go in as an apprentice, become a journeyman, and then become a master craftsman to really learn the trade around building something from start to finish. So there really wasn't a lot of division of classes. You had the person on the lowest rung working in the same workshop with the person on the highest rung. Also, because you were creating this complete project, the days were very long, 12 to 15-hour days. So there wasn't really time outside of the workshop to be socializing. So your workplace became also where you socialized. So not only were you working, you were drinking and gambling and gossiping and debating and all of those things that we associate with the barroom. So post 1850, as we move into the Industrial Revolution, quite a few things changed. First of all, the workforce changed. You had a lot more women coming into the workforce and immigrant labor. And this is important because on that manufacturing floor where you had this mixed group of people, men weren't as likely to do the gossiping that they would normally do in the barroom in this mixed company. Also, we were starting to see more of the division of classes. So on the production floor, you would have the lower classes and the day laborers, and then the managers and the owners were in their offices off-site or, you know, someplace away from the production floor. Also, labor specialization. No longer were you learning a craft from start to finish. You were learning a small part within the production line in order to optimize productivity. And with that came mechanization. So lots more machines, which means getting drunk or drinking on the job was not the safest and was no longer the best idea. So what those things led to on the other side is that no longer were the work days 12 to 15 hours. You were starting to see a more typical, 8 to 10 hour workday, which meant that outside of work, there was time for socialization. So the upper classes, the managers, the factory owners, they would be going to their private clubs, but these were also quite expensive and outside of the means of, the average labor or the lower classes. And so the saloon really started to fill that space that the private club held for the upper classes. And so the saloon got its first nickname, which was the Poor Man's Club. But also I think it could have been called the Boys Club because it was definitely a gendered space. Men would find their local, and that was usually based around commonalities, whether it was ethnicity or occupation. And once you entered in that space, it was pretty obvious that this was intended for men. So like in this photo, you can see the spittoon on the floor in front of the bar with the sawdust around it in case there were people that weren't the best of shots. There were the towels for their mustaches hanging from the bar. You can see the photo on the left-hand side. Maybe that was a heavyweight boxer. Frequently, the photos, the images, the photos, the pictures would be of nudes. You might see a urination trough along the bar so that men didn't actually have to move away from the standing bar if they needed to relieve themselves. All of these things made it pretty apparent and obvious that this wasn't a space intended for women. That didn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't see women in the space, but usually when you did, it was because they were working in the space, and most frequently in family-owned and run saloons. So they'd be working alongside their father or brothers or husbands, and usually making meals. So you could go in for the lunch and it would maybe be 5 cents and you get a beer and a meal as well. So the women would be there working. But every once in a while you'd see a woman come in for the lunch as well, but they would not come in through the front as all the men did. They had their own separate entrance that was usually in the back. These two photos were both taken in New Orleans, and so you can still see these on the streets there for your next visit. If you want to hunt them out, let me know. I can give you some guidance as to where they are. But the ladies' entrance in the back kind of served a few different purposes. The first was that it was inconspicuous. So as we start to see temperance rise and you have the nosy neighbors who may be a part of that movement, to be able to go in through the back, it wasn't as obvious. Also, going through the back meant you didn't have to go through that area that was very much intended for men. Remember, there was a urination trough. Not so cool. And finally, most women were purchasing for consumption off premise, which was called rushing the growler. And you would purchase the growler at the end of the bar. And so by going in the back entrance, you were able easily to get to that part of the bar at the end to make your purchases. So back entrance, the ladies' entrance would go into a back room, which was definitely used in mixed company and for, private functions and social occasions. So like weddings and celebrations and birthday parties and things of that nature. Anything that would normally be taking place in the private club of the upper echelons of society would take place in this back room. And despite the fact that it was a space intended for, mixed use, both men and women, women usually were expected to be accompanied by a male. And this was to kind of, make sure prostitution wasn't taking place, which did occur, but usually in only the most seediest of saloons. It wasn't really in the best interest of the owner to have prostitution taking place in their establishment. Not only would it draw the attention of the police, which was never a good thing, but also it would draw the ire of the wives of the regular patrons. By having all women being required to be there with a man, even in the back room, it helped to mitigate that factor. But, in a lot of cases, women just avoided the saloon altogether. And even just walking past it, where they would be, confronted by the catcalls of men who might be coming in or going out of the saloon. It was just something to be avoided. So at the same point in time, as the saloon was becoming kind of de rigueur and where you would socialize, the temperance movement was starting to boom as well. So by 1848, the Daughters of Temperance had over 30,000 members. And you can see here in this photo, they were kind of protesting outside of a saloon, kneeling, probably praying. And a lot of the accounts around saloons at this point in time came from the perspective of the temperance movement. They were very prolific in their writing and kind of cataloging what they were doing, not only in articles, in their own journals of sorts. They were writing songs. This must have been a barn burner, girls wait for a temperance man. And they would sing these songs as they waited outside of the saloons, kind of to proselytize, if you will, to the heathens that were coming in and out. And I love this photo here. It's a little bit grainy, but you can see on the right hand, on the ceiling, hanging from the ceiling, you see that's a black curtain. So when the women would come and protest outside and be praying and singing, they would lower the black curtain so they wouldn't have to look out the front windows at them. It was pretty crazy. You didn't have a lot of people, as far as the working class and the people working in the saloons, they weren't necessarily feeling the need to write about their day-to-day activities, but the temperance movement definitely did. So that's a lot of the accounts that we have from this time period. At the same point in time, this idea of temperance was coming from the top down. We had the wife of President Rutherford B. Hayes. She was an amazing teetotaler, and she decreed that no alcoholic beverages could be served in the White House. So during this period of time, there were all of these accounts of really boring state dinners that were taking place. And it's believed that he was not elected to a second term because of this. So you were really getting the message strong from the White House on down, that you should be partaking in the temperance movement and not in the activities of the saloon. At the same point in time, alcohol as medicine, however, was seen as more than okay. So Anne Whittenmeyer, who was once the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, served on the Sanitation Commission during the Civil War. And in 1864, she released the collections of recipes for use of special diet kitchens. And the recipe included all sorts of recipes for mulled wines and cordials and milk punch and eggnog that were all used for medicinal purposes. Edward Bach of Ladies' Home Journal questioned more than 50 members of the WCTU and found that 75% of them were using these very alcoholic medicines on a daily basis. Pinkham's was one of the most popular at the time. It was Pinkham's vegetable compound, and it was aimed specifically towards women. And it was seen to be, quote unquote, a positive cure for all the painful complaints and weaknesses so common among the ladies of the world. So the Pinkham family was located just down the road from me here in Lynn, Massachusetts, and they owned a grocery store. The entire family were teetotalers and were a part of the temperance movement, and they did not sell any alcoholic beverages in their grocery. And quickly, they found out that they were losing customers, right, and left because of this. And so they developed the Pinkham's vegetable compounds as, you know, really marketing it as respectability with a kick. So people were able to purchase this vegetable compound intended for medicinal purposes without, and the Pinkhams could feel good about it because it was good for inebriates in their thinking. Another one here was Parker's Tonic. It's their phrase here, as you can see, is rescued from a bed of suffering. Parker's Tonic brings the bloom of health to the cheek and delight to the heart. So that bloom of health to the cheek was mostly because it clocked in at about 42% ABV. So in addition to all of these kind of higher alcohol tonics and vegetable compounds and medicinals that we were seeing, opiates were also readily available, because still, if you were using the compounds and the tonics, you would be able to smell them on your breath. Whereas with the opiates, you wouldn't actually be able to know that you were having them in any sort of way. You didn't have that alcohol on your breath. So let's talk more specifically about women being behind the bar. You know, in the late 1800s, you were finding a lot of kitchen grog shops or bars, kitchen bars, especially throughout the tenements and among immigrant communities. You know, the Irish kitchen bar, which was known as the Shebeen, was seen as one of a very respectable way and a respectable source of income for widows. And people who would go and be patrons at somebody's kitchen bar or shebeen were seen as really contributing to a charitable cause. And so it was a spot where both men and women would hang out. And so that kind of showed kind of the difference between what was acceptable between the public and the private sphere at that point in time. These kind of kitchen bars and grog shops started to fall out of favor as the brewery-backed saloons really went on the rise towards the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. You know, at the same point in time, you start to see some of these. Okay, I'm gonna stop there for a minute. Okay, got a little off track there. So there were a few women that we do know about who were actively bartending during the mid to late 1800s. Martha King Nebula, who lived from 1802 to 1851, was the daughter of a porterhouse keeper. So she grew up in a family that worked within kind of this business of booze and entertaining, if you will. And she married a gentleman by the name of William Nebula, and he opened what was called Nebula's Garden in what is now Soho, and it was an outdoor space with music, and Martha was known to be running the bar, and so she became, this was at the point in time where people were really starting to use ice in cocktails, and she became known for her sherry cobbler, and you can see accounts of it in the newspapers of the time, the New York Sun and such, and although we're not certain if she created this particular cocktail, she definitely popularized it at the time, and it was associated with her. On the other coast in San Francisco, in 1852, there were 152 retail liquor establishments listed in San Francisco, and 20 of those were kept by women. One of the most popular women at the time who had some of those licenses was Mistress Ellen Moon. She actually came to San Francisco from Sydney, Australia. She was known for her temper, and she was married in Australia. Her husband irritated her for some reason, and in a fit of rage, she tore up her marriage license and left. And it ended up in San Francisco. She was also known for being a compassionate person as well, taking in waifs that the police would bring to her. But she was definitely well known throughout San Francisco for her establishments. And they were known to be a little bit rough and racy, but also they were very popular among kind of the cosmopolitans of the time. So you get doctors and lawyers and lots of journalists, artists, and she had a lot of reputable regulars. The Ivy Green was kind of known to be a hangout for the journalists. They called it the Hall of the Reporters Union. And eventually the first press club in San Francisco was set up halfway between the Ivy Green and City Hall. And she continued to run her establishments until she died by suicide in 1863. So towards the end of the 19th century, we start to see restrictions on unescorted women in the bar space ease, but the other ends. And so by 1890 in the census, we saw that 147 women listed themselves as bartenders. So move in the right direction, but that is opposed to the over 55,000 men who listed themselves as bartenders in the same census. So why is that? Why were there so many men and no women? Especially like, how did the apple fall so far from the tree? Because when you think about the old country, when you think about England and the colonists who came over, they were definitely used to seeing women as barmaids, yes? And so, I mean, I think about in 1731, James Ashley had the London Coffee House, which he had all female bartenders who were making, at that point in time, bowls of punch and tiffs, single servings of punch. So how was it that we come to the colonies and we end up with no female bartenders? Well, first of all, in the colonies, there weren't a lot of women. And so men had to take that job that had normally been held by women. And because there wasn't a lot of classism at the time, we were all just, everybody was rough and tumble in the colonies trying to find their way. There wasn't any kind of, there wasn't any issue or classism around the part of a man taking the role that would have normally been held by a woman. Men had to take all the roles because there were not many women here at that point in time. Well, as men were in that job and we started to see the cocktail develop, first of all, very simple cocktails like the sling and things of that nature. But then we move on and we get into these fancy drinks where it takes a little bit more technique and there's style around it and a little bit of flair and that sportsmanship. that results in higher wages. And all of a sudden, even though there were women available, men wanted to hold on to that job. They had a job that was, their pay was increasing as they were gaining more notoriety, and they didn't want to give it up, and they didn't want to share that space. And so there was really kind of this mythology that built up around the bar room being a space that was not for women, that it was dangerous and things of that nature, and so that men could hold on to their jobs. And I think one of the most perfect examples of that is William Schmidt, who many of you probably know because of his cocktail book, The Flowing Bowl. So William Schmidt was a bartender at the Standard Buffet No. 2, and that was a hangout for a ton of reporters here in New York. And they would go into the Standard Buffet No. 2, and if it was a slow news day, they would write about William Schmidt. So he was getting a lot of attention for the concoctions that he was making. So the owner decided to bring in some barmaids from England and Ireland to work with William Schmidt, and he was not happy about it. So on October 20th, 1891, the New York Sun reported that William Schmidt had handed in his resignation because he had been asked to train and work with 4 barmaids. And he decided that it was beneath him to do such. And the quote was, it was beneath him to be the mere superintendent of a pair of barmaids, and the honor and self-respect left him only one course, and that was to hand in his resignation. So the following day, the Sun, the continued reporting about this big to-do in the big cocktail world of New York, and they reported on that following day that the smiles, the glances, the pretty fingers, and the round cheeks were causing the recent friends of William to betray his memory by experiencing more delight from the newcomer's amateurish efforts and mute appeals for sympathy than ever was produced by the magical gyrations of liquids and glasses under William's expert fingers. Of course, that was followed by a full physical description of each one of the barmaids, including which barmaid the author of this particular piece found to be the most attractive. So it didn't end there. As you can see here, the only William Schmidt said, it requires a discriminating man with an artistic temperament to prepare mixed drinks, and all Americans want mixed drinks, hence barmaids are not a success. Well, that was not actually true, because the barmaids actually ended up being quite popular enough that the owner of the Standard Buffet continued to support more women coming over from England and Ireland to help staff his multiple establishments in New York. And the barmaids reported that they really were not having much trouble with the American cocktails at all, except for maybe the Pousse Cafe, which, I guess some things never change now. So the only William Schmidt ended up joining up with the Williams Christian Temperance Union, and he worked with them to get a bill making it illegal for women to work in bars to try and get that passed. And I think it's important to recognize that a piece of legislation like that not only affected the female bartenders that might be working in the establishment, but there were all women doing other jobs within the saloons as well. There was one account that I found in New Mexico in May of 1889. They had just passed a law saying that women couldn't work in bar rooms, and so it was affecting piano players and musicians. And so there was an account of one piano player who moved the piano up against a window, and she would stand outside on the porch and put her hands through the window to play the piano so that she could keep her job. So these restrictions that were starting to come through because of the temperance movement were affecting women outside of just the bartenders. It was also affecting other women working within the space. There was also Christiana Beresheim. We don't know much about her. This was an article from a New Jersey newspaper, actually, but she was the oldest barmaid in Massachusetts and the only woman barmaid in Boston. And so we knew she was there in 1911, but we don't know much more about her. Unfortunately, I'd love to know where her bar was and more about her. But I think it's just really important to note that so much of what we know is based upon socioeconomics, right? The women that I've been speaking about, we know about them because they were really catering to like the upper classes and the well-heeled of society. And so that resulted in their names being remembered. There were plenty of women who were working in bars and working behind bars, but really what we find out about them is only because of situations where the situation went south, right? So we're finding out about them through the newspaper, the police reports. And like, for example, in 1879, the police records of three women from different bars were being brought in on the same night for breaking the New York excise law. In Chicago in 1903, Frances Schultz and her barkeeper Martha were brought in for beating up a Chicago strike-breaking cop for trying to remove a striker from their saloon, and so unfortunately, if you weren't a part of those upper classes, we weren't going to hear about you, and you weren't going to be memorialized in any sort of way in print unless it was something bad. And I think that's, once again, we're trying to find the stories of the women in the silence, and by putting all of the pieces together. But luckily, as we move into Meaghan's time, which I'm going to turn it over to her now, we start to learn more about some of the amazing personalities that were out there, especially during Prohibition. So Meaghan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks so much for passing it down to me. And we're going to keep talking about a lady's presence, and we're going to talk about women as entrepreneurs and also as personalities in the bar scene. So now we're getting into the 1900s, and as you can see, there's a lot affecting social change at this time. And it's really had an impact on the evolving space of women in and around bars. And as we've seen exceptions farther back in time, such as the lovely cave-dwelling Alice Guest, I found another shift around this time regarding women and the bar scene. And this can be connected to a lot of this social change that we see here that's happening in the US, the increasing amount of political clout and legal protection, which, let's remember, is starting from pretty much zero. It's not just temperance and eventually the federal prohibition that happens, but also the movement towards women's suffrage, a changing job market that's related to World War I and then World War II, and the beginning stages of the equal rights movement. During this time, and even right up until today, we see women use all their past experiences, their past roles, and even use this time to reinvent themselves in the bar setting. Women have long been known as maternal figures. We naturally collaborate, we multitask, we share the spotlight, we keep the ship sailing, so to say, and I have some great examples bringing all of this to the bar world. So let's keep moving. So I did want to touch on the Spanish flu epidemic, global pandemic of 1918 to 1920. And it's worth noting that in my prior research, we've been doing versions of the seminar since about 2014. It really did not come up as a topic or a note that impacted these women that I'll talk about, even though they definitely all lived through it. It was a major time of social disruption. We lost almost 700,000 Americans, which is 10 times the amount that we lost in what was called the Great War, now known as World War I. So a huge disruption to business, to travel, to gathering at that time. And that was all on top of a time that was heavily influenced by the war. So heads of households and a lot of medical personnel like doctors were already overseas. There was rations, there was wartime media censorship. So there was a lot going on. And this also actually greatly affected the generation that was 20 years old to 40 at that time, unlike the usual years of flu greatly affecting an older generation. This was a big impact on that generation in about 1918. And as we've been reading a lot about the pandemic that we're in now, reflecting on the Spanish flu, perhaps there is something to just the weight of the despair of those years that lends itself to the silence of them. So before I get into all the fun personalities that we'll start to see around Prohibition, I do want to take this time to reflect on the advent of women continuing to step into this role of expert host, expert household manager, really the one that would keep the domestic places running, often with help and sometimes without. And when we get closer to Prohibition, we really see the advent of cocktail parties happening and women again establishing themselves as hosts, both in home entertaining, as parties started to go more underground at that time, and also later we'll see in speakeasies and future bars. So we're starting here in 1901, and we'll move up through the 30s with these books. This is a great bibliography that the ladies over at Pomp and Whimsy put together. So all women authors here, and you can see dainties for home parties, tested recipes, etiquette for all occasions. And then moving along a bit later, you see Virginia Elliott is published here twice, who was quite a quiet public presence, but established herself as an expert on the cocktail party. And some of these books were written specifically around Prohibition, but would either quite be serious about it or a bit cheeky in the way that there were substitutions that could be made. And my favorite one is here at the end, 1936, Live Alone and Like It. The subtitle is A Guide for the Extra Woman, and that was published by a Vogue editor and actually became a bestseller. So here we are at Prohibition, 1920, temperance morphed into federal prohibition, and there's a few cities like New Orleans where it never quite took. In the Journal of the Louisiana Historical Association, they had a chapter that I found called The Feminine Side of Bootlegging. A researcher, Tanya Sanchez, put that together. And the researcher pieced together both newspaper articles and arrest records around that period. There was an exception in these acts around Prohibition for both culinary use, so the sherry that would go in a turtle soup in New Orleans, or also around home brewing, which was legal for home consumption at the time. And the writer noted that most violators of bootlegging laws were women from recently immigrated groups, where alcohol would have been part of their social fabric, and it was not a far leap from home use to selling some on the side or hosting underground socials. Many arrested were single mothers trying to make ends meet, like I have the names Marie Hop, Dominica Cortano, Odelia Ray, or even 83-year-old Rose Fontana, who was noted using broken English to share the health benefits of a daily drink. In her defense, it does not say what her original language was. It's also noted here that out of records for 173 female arrests, only 6 were noted as African American. The journal notes that white Americans were much more supportive of Prohibition in the first place than any other group, and often officially and unofficially policed mostly in their own neighborhoods. So if these guys were your neighbors, you are not getting away with any underground parties or selling your extra home brew. So let's get into New York City and Prohibition, which was quite lively. Perhaps you've seen shows and movies about it. So we're on to Our Lady Texas Gwinnen, who was born actually in Waco, Texas in 1884 into a strict Irish Catholic home, but she always had a flair for the dramatic, and she leaves to become an actress. Tex, that's where she gets her name, has some success in silent westerns, but ends up in New York City around the time of Prohibition, and she's a bit aged out of her star status in the Western films. But right before Prohibition, we find her using her talent and clout to host events at the Café Beaux-Arts and the King Cole Room. But in 1924, she gets started in the club biz, and a hustler, Larry Fay, becomes her first partner in a nightclub on West 45th Street called the El Fay, and that's where she coins her infamous term, "Hello, sucker." "Hello, sucker" is my nightclub salutation to one and all. I mean it to say, hello, pal, aren't we all alike after all? So that was Tex's favorite greeting for one and all, to greet everyone at the club, kind of put them all on the same level and take the pressure off remembering everyone's name. But of course, at that time, clubs were quite short-lived, as they were all illegal. After the El Fay, Tex continues to become a partner in everything she does next, which is quite exceptional for the time. She really knows her worth. She also knows where the money is coming in and makes sure she gets her split, including at the coat check. So the 300 Club was next, where one could buy a quart of whiskey or scotch for $20, a bottle of champagne for $25 out of a potato sack in the alley. All this fine stuff was made right over the line in New Jersey there by her partners. So then comes the Century Club, then the Salon Royale. And throughout that time, Tex is known as quite a savvy businesswoman and a great host. She was known also for being quite generous, for picking up the tabs, especially for younger people and servicemen. So there's a raid in 1928, and Tex is arrested for being a public nuisance. And in the opening statement, the district attorney says, Miss Gwynnin's job was to make whoopee. She made everyone feel at home in a jovial way. There was entertainment, but also a thumbing of the nose at the law. And Tex takes the stand in her own defense. And as part of the evidence, Tex says that she actually doesn't drink. Her only vices are black coffee and cigarettes. The other thing that causes a bit of an uproar in the courtroom is that one detective visited her club 4 times to gather evidence, including taking his wife out one night on the taxpayer's dollar to gather his evidence. So Tex is acquitted. She's not a public nuisance. She gets right in her limo and goes back to work. Tex never had children herself, but always thought of the dancers and the young entertainers in the clubs as her children, and would often drive them out to beaches in Long Island after a night in a smoky club underground to get some fresh air. So now let's move on to another lady of New York City, Belle Livingstone, a friend of Tex, actually. So she was born in 1875, but abandoned as an infant in Kansas. She ends up in Chicago with her foster parents, and she's named Isabel Graham. However, her father refused to let her join a theater group, and she got married quickly, but then left both of those men behind to hit New York City and find a job on the stage. And that's where she becomes Belle Livingstone, and her second life begins. Broadway took her to London and then to Paris, a few more marriages along the way, and she returns to New York City in 1927 during Prohibition. She's rich in spirit, but not so much in cash. So Belle is looking for perhaps a third wind, you might call it. She befriends Texas Gwynnin and then opens a series of high-end speakeasies in Midtown townhouses. One of the last in that run was called the Country Club, where both John D. Rockefeller and Al Capone visited on opening night, but also where Belle was arrested in her silk pajamas trying to outrun the dry agents, and she ended up serving 30 days in jail. In all her clubs and her life ongoing, she had quite an eye for striking details, which continued to her final detail, which was her grave monument that she designed herself in France, and it was etched with, "This is the only stone I had left unturned." And that was when Belle was 82 in 1957. So now we're going to find a character of the Midwest in this time, Dirty Helen, as she's called. But she was born Helen Worley in an affluent family in Indiana, and ends up following her childhood sweetheart, future husband, to Cincinnati. And she lives quite a sheltered life. She has 2 young children around this time that she finds her taste for saloons. It's really a woman's intuition that her husband is up to something that draws her out at night. And she is just enthralled with the nightlife and the saloons of the town and the life of loose women, as she called it. So she goes on to divorce this first husband. She gets 5 more along the way. She moves to Chicago. She rubs elbows with Al Capone and his crew. She moves around the Midwest, making money in the bedroom, as she called it. And then, she ends up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. First, she runs a cat house. Then she opens a speakeasy. And she says that part of the reason she never got in too much trouble there was it was mostly open during the day, and her speakeasy would close by 8 or 9 at night when the dry agents were really out on the town, and she was serving some of the best fried chicken in town. So in 1933, she has the chance to go legit. There's an opportunity for businesses to get official licenses as Prohibition is wrapping up, and the Sunflower Inn is reborn in a legitimate form, and it goes on to run for about 30 more years. And Helen had quite a special way of doing business. She liked to think of herself as very democratic. She would draw people of all classes and senators but college kids and servicemen going off to a tour of duty, and they would all come for a visit to the Sunflower Inn at one time or another. So Helen had no seats. She only had plush carpeting, so everyone was literally on the same level if you were at the Sunflower Inn. She also only served Old Fitz bourbon or House of Lords scotch. And it was a funny joke, a kind of hazing, if you will, for new visitors to be sent up to the bar by their friends to order a martini from Helen and really find out why her mouth got her nickname Dirty Helen, because she would really read you the riot act for not knowing what to order at her bar. So that's Dirty Helen, quite a character. And now we're getting to the end of Prohibition here, so we have to give a shout out to Pauline Sabin, who helped speed up the eventual repeal of Prohibition. So she was a well-heeled society lady, political connections on both sides of her family, and she originally supported Prohibition, but soon saw that it was failing. She actually felt a deep offense that the idea was you had to be a proper wife and a mother, you had to support Prohibition. She really felt that young Americans were learning to disrespect all laws because this one was so flagrantly disobeyed, and that people were actually starting to drink younger because they were drawn in by the allure of bootlegging and speakeasies. So here we see some of Pauline's genius, which was to reverse the Women's Christian Temperance Union approach and their propaganda and refurbish the message to say Prohibition is not working. She was also one of the original celebrity endorsements, if you will, going door to door with her society friends and holding town halls to spread their ideas. So Pauline was a huge help in speeding up the end of Prohibition, which all us bar ladies have her to be thankful for. So now we're in the land of legal bars. Prohibition is over, but we are also coming to the end of the Great Depression in 1937, 1938. Helen David is in Michigan. She's 19 years old, and her mother decides to turn the family ice cream parlor into a saloon, which Helen is actually not a fan of. She's quite against it and thinks it's quite unladylike to own a saloon. But her mother says something to the effect that a lady can be a lady in any circumstance, but she's got to have a buck in her pocket. So the ice cream parlor becomes a saloon, it becomes the Brass Rail Bar, and it actually becomes Helen David's life work. She tends bar into her 70s. She actually ends up living above the bar, and she comes downstairs from the apartment well into her 90s to greet guests and keep up with staff and neighbors. So the Brass Rail Bar is known as the Cheers of Port Huron. And you might know the name Tony Abou-Ganim, well known for Las Vegas bar programs, and he's traveled all over the world and presented at Tales of the Cocktail and things like that. And he is the nephew of Helen David. So he says it was Helen David and the Brass Rail Bar that really ignited his love of bartending, the craft of cocktails, and hospitality. Helen David was also an early pioneer of giving hourly employees sick time, a paid holiday break, and also insurance. The holiday season was Helen's favorite time of year, and she quite famously made Tom and Jerry's every year, starting on Thanksgiving and running to New Year's every year. And finally, I do want to make sure everyone knows that Helen David lives on through the USBG. She's actually a 2-time breast cancer survivor. So Tony teamed up with the USBG to start a memorial fund, and that is to help any bartenders or those in hospitality that are battling cancer on their own. They can apply for funds through this, and more info is available on the USBG National Charity Foundation page. So Helen truly lives on in the bar community still to this day. And now it's time for me to pass this along. We're in legal bars, but we are not out of legal issues for women trying to get behind one. So we're going to keep talking about that, and I'll pass it down the line.
So throughout history, female bartending has permeated into the realms of politics, law, economics, morality, and social standards, religion, gender debates, and industrial labor concerns in the marketplace. So as we look at past debates, we can see that these social norms and biases still permeate a modern society. I found these articles, more recent articles by Dave Wondrich and Jillian Kramer, which kind of talk a little bit about this current struggle. So I highly recommend reading those. There are great retrospectives and still talk about some of the issues. What I found interesting was that in Dave's article, he does cite numerous women bar owners in the year 1852 in the city of San Francisco. So of the 127 liquor establishments in this new boom town that were listed, 20 were kept by women. But what he notes is that although these women were there, when and if women are mentioned behind the bar, it is generally to speak badly of their moral character and also of the establishment that hired her. So this taboo manifested itself in some places made explicitly by law or otherwise merely customary morality judgments or attacking reputations. And this lasted in a formal sense until the 1960s, but repercussions still linger today in pockets of the world. So we look at a little bit of where some of these, where we can see some of these biases set up, and some of them come from literature. So we see references in literature to women behind the bar. One very notable example is in James Fenimore Cooper's novel in 1821, The Spy. So he talks about Betty Flanagan, and she's described as having been brought up on liquor, but was peculiarly well qualified by education. And this was actually, the character of Betty Flanagan was based on a real bartender, Catherine, known as Kitty Hustler, which née Cherry, that was her name, from 1762 to 1832. And she was immortalized as Betty Flanagan. And she was born in Pennsylvania and married a Continental soldier in 1777, and supposedly kept a tavern in what was called the Neutral Ground, which was between the American and British troops in what is now in New York, Westchester County, so just kind of north of the city. Where she either invented or helped popularize the American drink, the cocktail, because we know that we see references to that in that area. And she was keeping a tavern outside of Buffalo, New York, when Cooper met her in the 1810s. But we look at his description about her, she didn't quite provide this example deemed worthy of emulation. As Cooper puts it, her faults were a trifling love of liquor, excessive filthiness and a total disregard of all decencies of language. So whether this is based on Kitty or this is, him using this example and then tying it, really feeding into the norms and making her this very foul-mouthed character, we don't know. But we do see other people like James Joyce with this quote below, where they are really seeing women in this space as leading men to drink, and that there is this idea that they are sirens, and that when women are in these spaces, they're just like leading you into the vices. So when we go to look at a little bit of other reasons, back to our friend William Schmidt, there was just general sexism that was being portrayed about women in the space. So, William basically would say that he used the skill of bartending to promote gender discrimination, and that he could not afford to endanger his reputation, his professional standing by consenting to work as the Barmaids director. So they were bringing over these barmaids who had previously worked in Europe, and he said he would not stand behind the bar with a lady. Yet these women who were coming from the UK actually were quite skilled, and they had tremendous amounts of experience, and said that they actually picked up this American style quite easily. And this is based on the fact that in Europe in the 1901 census, they counted 27,000 female bartenders in the UK and Ireland. And by 1908, that figure had increased to an estimated over 100,000. So in the US at the same time, there were only 147 women bartenders, which was only 0.3% of the bartenders. So you kind of had this removal of those restrictions earlier in Europe. And as you see those immigrants coming over with the skill, you kind of see some of this tension happening. So, bartenders, prohibition and its views of women is we've tackled talking with Misty about, temperance, but the lore of bar work relied not only upon the pragmatics of the higher wages and more congenial working conditions, but also upon this idea of the barmaid's cultural mystique. So these ideas come up quite often, that you can't disassociate the woman from her work. So if barmaids use liquor to morally corrupt men and use women to lure men into drink, then there's this issue. You're not opening up that space. So as we said, morality was used to say that these women would then corrupt young women as well, the ones who worked there, and also would embolden women to want to go into those spaces, so to make it easier for women to drink there if there were other ladies there. So to address this newfound issue, there are plenty of spaces, bars chose to have designated times when women could work at the bar, or as in Europe, they had designated spaces for when women would come into the space. They had snugs, and women would be essentially deposited into this area to drink behind a closed area that the bartender could just serve them. While plenty of establishments post-prohibition allowed drinkers of both sexes, certain bars banned women under the assumption that an unaccompanied woman was a prostitute. So that was ways that they could keep women out of spaces. During Prohibition, many women gained employment in bars, pretty much by the function of it being illegal anyway. So that really did open up spaces. But again, pre and post-prohibition is where we really see the heavy regulations trying to keep women out. So in pre-prohibition, in 1892, the New York Times reported a crackdown on 6 tavern owners who employed women in dram shops. And so Missouri ruled it a felony for women to work in dram shops, bars, and concert halls. Montana threatened women with arrest and forfeiture of their property. Michigan didn't even allow women entrance to any place that sold alcohol. So you see these different rules in different localities happening. Movements began to ban women even from standing or sitting in bars. And that freedom that was gained from the 1920s was being challenged. And in many instances, women were losing those opportunities. Male bartenders started to speak out louder against women attending in bars. Women bartenders were described as magnets for controversy. So they were not only a threat to the jobs of men and a friend to the male-dominated bar atmosphere. Many men thought that women in those spaces would be, speaking of gender pay gap, which was yesterday, they thought that women coming into the space would then lower the wages for male bartenders because there was competition in the space and that women would work for less. In addition to speaking out against barmaids, bartenders unions pressured bar owners to fire or refuse to hire female bartenders and submitted proposals to state legislators prohibiting the employment of women as bartenders. Bartenders argued that women would be bad conversationalists, inefficient, and flirtatious. The presence of women bartenders would also give wives reasons to keep husbands from patronizing bars and endanger women's morals. So the bartenders unions kept women from joining or working in bars staffed by union employees. So that was one way that they were able to organize and use their systems to keep women out of at least unionized spaces. Temperance activists and moralists joined bartenders in the efforts to prevent women from working behind the bar. This is actually a case in 1939 from Pennsylvania, where after school hours, a teacher dating a saloon keeper tended bar and made drinks for him. The school board fired her on grounds of immorality and competence as measured by its standards for teachers. She in turn sued them, stating that it isn't immoral to supplement my school pay by working after hours as a barmaid, nor does my serving drinks at night impair my competence to teach during the day. The board's attorney stated, would any parents in this courtroom consider a barmaid fit to teach his children? And with that, he won that argument and she did lose the case. So the ban on barmaids was temporarily lifted and delayed as men were drafted into service. And during World War II, when the U.S. entered into the fight and thousands of men were shipped off for military service, women went to work. Patriotic women took to the mahogany, serving their countrymen who remained at home. And they were considered to be a bit of a comfort at that time, in these spaces. And that's important to know. So they held space for community in those pubs and spaces. Here's a really great one. This is from the Chicago Tribune, and this is Carmela Sink says she's tossing out a customer from her father's tavern. She's a mother too, and has been bartending in this bar for 5 years. And these barmaids, for the duration, as they were called, were hired on the condition that they would resign as soon as the men came home. That year, the local bartenders union there in Chicago admitted 123 women who already had donned the apron and taken to swabbing the mahogany. That is a quotation from the article. They worked under union rules and earned the Chicago minimum wage of $45 a week. So thus ending that idea that they would lower the wages. It turned out the women did just fine. Their bosses in the area of the bartenders union seemed surprised. Like I said, when it comes to mixed drinks, it appears they have the touch. Maybe it's their instinctive food mixing ability. Anyway, they can shake or stir up a whiskey sour or cocktail as if they were stirring up a cake. Similarly, in New York, I found some examples in 1939 of a group who started the Brooklyn Barmaid Local. So specifically in NYC, women were working in the Navy Yard, actually building ships, but the Brooklyn Navy Yard wasn't the only place where they had taken to help during the war, and the Brooklyn bar scene was quite reliant upon that. So to legitimize their work, members of the local 101 completed 3 months of job training before they were employed. They also agreed not to work past midnight or give their last name to patrons. Local businesses praised these women for maintaining the industry and creating a comforting atmosphere during a time of stress. And by the end of the 1940s, the union included over 100 barmaids working in 75 Brooklyn bars. So, but when the original workforce returned, the bartender and barmaid unions actually seemed to coexist peaceably. But in January 1950, Assemblyman Alfred A. Lama of Brooklyn proposed an amendment to start barring barmaids from bars. So these are just some of the different quotes from the women who were impacted by this. They definitely took to calling out Lama's character. They called him a chaser and an old meanie. And the head of the local 101 explained that the unions had been working together without any conflict. Both union members reported that the male bartenders union and the barmaids local. But within 2 days, the bartenders union was singing a different tune with political backing. They took to the streets and protested against their female counterparts. So a bit of that political pressure coming in. But as the women were saying, this was actually women being able to work in these bars in these big cities. It was really helpful for their economy and gave them the flexibility to be able to take care of their children and during the day and bartend at night. So we see really how much this is going to affect women in the workspace. And the union leader, finally, he was 100% behind the amendment to ban the women. But when he was asked if a woman's place was in the home, he didn't comment. So, and eventually the Brooklyn stories died down, suggesting that Lama's bill lost steam. But Brooklyn was not alone in this battle. That same spring, Manhattan bar workers entered a dispute when 5 barmaids were refused admittance to the Manhattan Bartenders Union, which already represented waitresses, female waitresses. So the union picketed the barmaids who had been working at 711 8th Avenue, and they took the case to the Supreme Court. And a lawyer for the union argued that barmaids were un-American and noted that many other cities, including Chicago, had already banned female bartenders. The court did not force the union to admit the women, but it did uphold the idea that women had the right to work behind the bar. So the decision didn't quite give barmaids equal rights, but it did allow them to continue serving. In 1945, Michigan legislators amended the liquor control law to include a licensing requirement for bartenders called the Bartending Act. So this act included a provision that banned any woman whose father or husband did not own a bar from bartending in cities with a population of over 50,000. The law prohibited female bar owners from tending in their own establishments. and caused hundreds of barmaids to face financial ruin. In May 7th, 1948, the Minnesota State Supreme Court upholds banning women and ruled women bartenders were not as efficient as men. And it was a 4-3 decision, and the court held that men were just better bartenders because they were stronger and could handle boisterous drunks. And in 1942, a commission to study the Michigan control law recommended reforms to improve enforcement and prevent abuse was formed. And it released its report in the following year. And many of its recommendations were passed as amendments to the Liquor Control Act in 1945. And Judge Frank Picard, the commission chairman, recommended the licensing of bartenders, again, for health and law enforcement reasons. So we see this idea of formalizing and this licensing as a way to keep women out, since most of that was going to be through unions. This recommendation was one of the amendments that passed in 1945 as part of the Michigan system for controlling the sale of liquor, requiring the licensing in all cities having a population over 50,000 or more, but no female may be licensed unless she's the wife or daughter of a male owner of a licensed establishment. So again, just layers and layers of bureaucracy keeping women out. A class of women bartenders in Detroit challenged the statute in court in Fitzpatrick v. Liquor Control Commission, but the law was upheld in deference to the state legislature and the desire to protect women. In 1947, though, bar owner Valentine Gossert and her daughter Margaret and 26 other owners and barmaids petitioned the federal court for relief from this law that made them economically uncompetitive, is what they argued. They hired Ann Davidow and a 3-judge panel of the Eastern District denied relief to the women. On appeal, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the ruling, confirming that women did not have the right to enter all professions and that occupational choice was a privilege, not a liberty. So by affirming the constitutionality of the statute, the Supreme Court legitimated the second-class position of women in employment. And this precedent set in Gossert v. Cleary deprived bar owners of the ability to compete equitably in liquor businesses. It denied them the right to enter and pursue the occupation of their choice. It contributed to the sex segregation of labor that still marks in our workforce today. And so although a desire to protect these women from being exploited derived from earlier sex-specific labor laws, the history of Michigan's Bartending Act actually provides evidence that the law was rooted in desire to protect male bartenders from economic competition with barmaids and not to shelter the women from the dangers of the saloon. So you start seeing more and more the frustrated alewives. 1950, Wilson v. Hacker. And here the plaintiff is the owner of a restaurant and tavern that is employing 3 women as bartenders. And they sought an injunction against the defendant, who were the unions, who were picketing her premises in an effort to induce her to enter into a union shop agreement. And she didn't want to enter that agreement because the fact is, if she had entered the Bartenders League of America, they refused to accept women as members, and she refused to enter into any agreement which would in effect require the discharge of her employees. So you see that kind of battle waging on. What happens here is a lot of pitting the barmaids and waitresses kind of join the fight. We see a little bit of that happening where their women are pitted against each other in this place. So women who are in the union are not wanting women to come in and be bartenders in the union, and it's protecting their position as we've been pit together. Some different articles that I found, such in the New York Times in April 8th, 1950, you have some arguments about a woman who owned a tavern from the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union. They said, does Rose Miller, who operates the tavern, want the speakeasy days again? We think there is no place for a woman behind the bar, and we think there are some things women should not do: digging coal or wrestling or playing football or tending bar. So you have these kind of interesting debates going on. Subsequently, and they're kind of all happening in different areas. So we're kind of trying to figure out how these women are working together and how these suits, many of the women in the affidavits in the suits that came forward to court said that they were tending barn or support sick husbands or provide for their children. And they contended that the waitress salary was just inadequate to support their families, and they knew no other occupation, and they would lose their entire means of livelihood if they were banned from bartending. And these affidavits also suggested that they had good experiences at their work. The bar owners thought that these women were actually better employees than male bartenders, and customers actually did say that they preferred female bartenders. In 1953, Jean Finney, the president of Michigan Barmaids Association, gained national attention and asserted that waitresses had no more to worry about with customers than barmaids did, because behind the bar, the barmaid was in charge and protected from unwanted pinching and touching. She actually received this big spread in Life magazine, and she really claimed that the Bartending Act did not protect women. There was no requirement for a husband or father bar owner to be present when his daughter was tending bar. So really, what kind of protections were in place? Moreover, women were permitted to waitress and serve liquor, so why not from behind the bar? So one Michigan barmaid insisted that she would not become a waitress because she said, you're safer behind the bar. Out there, you have to keep smacking down customers. So as a result of press, localities began to change their tune a little bit. We found examples that in Atlantic City, for example, in 1950, had a compromise to let women who have been tending bar maintain their positions, but denied new applications for women to enter the occupation. Unfortunately, in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1955, the barmaids lost in court. 19 barmaids brought a suit claiming that they were deprived of their constitutional right to equal protection under the law. And the New Jersey State Supreme Court approved a Hoboken ordinance of banning women from tending bar for a salary. The ordinance said it would be all right if a woman who owned more than half a tavern, dispensed alcoholic drinks, or a tavern owner's wife or daughter could do that. So it's just this idea again of keeping women out. A bill proposed in the New York State, which followed Michigan's banning of women serving liquor with the same exceptions of waitresses or women owners of family businesses, got defeated in Albany. Miss Freeman, who was a representative for the Barmaids Association in 1953, said that the Local 15 was for the bill and responsible for it reappearing every year, and even owners had been reluctant to help the barmaids. And she said that this is a win today, but we'll probably have to keep fighting this every year. Also that spring in the New York Supreme Court, Manhattan bar workers entered a dispute when 5 barmaids were refused to be admitted to the Manhattan Bartenders Union, which already represented waitresses, and the union picketed the barmaids. And that case was brought to the Supreme Court and it was struck down. So we start seeing lots of different cases, and the full law to ban barmaids in New York was lifted in 1953 on March 7th. So we have to see how even this exists through to the 70s. So even in 1970, for example, women face discrimination behind the bar. Again, morality reasons are being cited, all those different examples. And in the 1960s, the powers of the union start to wane, and more bars with attached restaurants began to hire women. So as it was more socially acceptable for women to tend bar in a place that primarily served food, we start breaking down some of those old perceptions of it being a dark bar, and there's now a whole hospitality image of the profession. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act, along with the 1964 Equal Pay Act, ushered in big changes as they gave women legal precedent to challenge discriminatory laws. And in some places, like Wisconsin, the laws changed in one city at a time, with mayors and aldermen in different municipalities altering local ordinances individually. In other places like California, the battles were fought in court. In the late 1960s, The owner of the Classic Cat strip club in Los Angeles decided that it might be profitable for him, for his strippers to take turns shaking cocktails behind the bar after their onstage performances. The idea of topless bartending earned the attention of Edward J. Kirby, who was the director of California's Alcohol Beverage Control Agency, who was cleaning up establishments that were engaging in lewd activities. So this was something that he took quite a big interest in. And the case made its way through the California court system, ending up at the state Supreme Court in May 1971 as the Sailor Inn versus Kirby. And the Sailor Inn was the Classic Cats Corporation name, and they were representing not just the Classic Cat Club, but other bars that had also skirted the law in hiring female bartenders. The case was fortified by the intervention of a feminist clerk named Wendy Webster Williams. Williams had just started working for Justice Raymond Peters when she came across another judge's memo urging the court to simply deny this case. So she looked further into the complaint and looked past, the fact that she was looking at a complaint about a strip club and the morality that was being imposed into the nature of the bars, and recognized that the case was a blatant discrimination, job discrimination case. So Peters instructed her to write a memo, and she did, arguing that any employment discrimination against women deserved strict scrutiny from the court. And her memo convinced the justices to take up the case. Furthermore, she also noticed that the actual Sailor Inn brief, when it was filed, didn't really present a very strong case. So she got a feminist, a female law professor, and 2 female law students to write a amicus brief that was good. That was so good that the strip club's attorneys used it to win their case. When the case was finally heard, California's Attorney General Thomas C. Lynch and Evil J. Younger argued a male owner or male bartender must also be present in order to preserve order and protect patrons. And the court vehemently disagreed, saying that this argument ignores modern day reality. Today, most bars, unlike saloons of the Old West, are relatively quiet, orderly, and respectable places that are patronized by both men and women. And even if they were not, many bars employ bouncers whose sole job is to keep order. So there we go. As we see some of these changes starting to come to fruition, and as the 1970s push further, we see more social change that make it more possible for spaces to be more open.
All right, thank you, Lynnette. So I want to touch a little bit on the fight for civil rights. Jules Ketchwan was born from the ashes of discrimination. In the 1970s, various West Hollywood nightclubs refused entrance to Thais Williams because she was a Black lesbian. At the time, it was groundbreaking for a woman to own and operate a nightclub. Under California law, it was illegal for women to bartend during this time period. So Jules Ketchwan was a dance bar owned by Jewel Thais Williams, located on West Pico Boulevard in Los Angeles. Open for 40 years, it was the longest running Black gay dance bar in Los Angeles. After nearly closing in 2015, it was purchased by Mitch Edelson, who reopened under new management. Briefly called Union after the change in management, it has since reverted to the Ketchwan moniker. Disco began in clubs like Jules Ketchwan, where Black, Latinx, and LGBTQIA+ community members could celebrate their cultures outside of discriminatory white-owned venues, and this was really important. They needed a safe place to be able to commune together. Club founder Jewel Thais Williams explains that the club's name came from a term gay men used for going out on the prowl and trying to pick somebody up. And here she can be seen pictured with Hillary Clinton. So there was a documentary that came out in 2015 called Jules Ketchwan. And in the documentary, Thais Williams, who identifies as a lesbian, discuss the 42 years of success mixed with hardship. And I mean, we can probably imagine how difficult it must have been at the time, breaking all of the barriers, what she had faced. Jules Ketchwan became a banner name nightlife club for the entertainment elite, with the likes of Chaka Khan and Whitney Houston performing during their heyday. It simultaneously earned a reputation as a site for Black LGBTQIA+ and AIDS-impacted people to safely party and build community. For instance, KCET noted that the club hosted the United Fellowship Church of Christ, a congregation for Black LGBTQIA+ individuals in 1986, which again is such a huge deal if we're taking into consideration what was occurring during that time period. As her nightclub grew more and more popular, it became known as the unofficial Studio 54 of the West. And Williams was known as a role model on how to fight discrimination and shatter barriers across racial, social, and cultural lines. The Catch Fund was also popular amongst many performers and celebrities, including Sylvester Rick James, Gloria Gaynor, Janet Jackson, as I mentioned earlier, Chaka Khan, Whitney Houston, Donna Summers, Tina Turner, and Luther Vandross, and many, many more. This fame also bred opposition, and the club endured financial setbacks as many white prospective patrons abandoned the venue or tried to buy it out. This is such an important part and aspect of history because it allows us to see that there were many individuals who were really placing themselves in the position where they could push barriers and all in all open many, many possibilities and opportunities for those to come. So this is a beautiful story that I recommend each and every one of you leans into a bit more to really understand the difficulties during this time and how we can now celebrate their accomplishments and continue to allow spaces and places and opportunities for others who need our assistance in paving the way. All right, and now I pass it over to Lynnette. Thank you.
So modern trailblazers and troublemakers. So in 1983, bartending was the field in which the most gains for women's liberation in the workforce was achieved. In the early 1980s, 47% of the bartender workforce was women, compared to 24% in the 1970s. And we kind of start seeing this breakdown by the mid of this kind of old stereotype. So by the mid 1970s, women had conquered that question of whether they were suitable for this noble profession of bartending. And actually, especially when, larger chains actually started to hire women bartenders. So the Holiday Inn chain discovered that bar revenues actually went up when they had what they described as a cheerful young woman was doing the mixing. And in this new, these women were, highly trained. There were big training systems to implement the cocktail programs there. And so this was really legitimizing the profession. And you really see that as the new world of culinary cocktails and women have really distinguished themselves coming through this time. And the 80s and 90s were, again, we start seeing cocktail dive bars. It's more of clubs. And those environments actually were extremely gendered spaces. However, you did see more access to positions in those establishments with women, and that would be, depending on what that space was portraying, you would see women given access to kind of fit the theme of the club. On the rock and roll scene, you definitely had a lot of women working there. Not only women who were musicians who were bartending, but you just see this kind of shift in women in the spaces. But as we move towards really when we get to kind of what our world is and the craft bartending world, and when this started with, I have to mention Dale DeGroff and Sasha Petrosky as two people who really started to impact, at least for sure, where my challenge, my pedigree came from of New York craft bartending. But Dale started to bring back the idea of fresh juice and going back to really training again and learning the old drinks and then the new drinks that you created, having this really classic cocktail, the modern classic cocktails. Dale worked at the Rainbow Room, and I have talked to him a bit about that space and, asked if there were any women who worked behind the bar. And there were women who worked in the space, but not behind the bar. And, you know, when Dale talks about that, he talked a little bit about the time that, you know, that this space specifically, the manager who was running it just didn't see women behind the bar. But that did not stop Dale from actually having a very prominent female apprentice, and then he's opened bars with her, and we'll talk about her in the next slide. But also, you know, Sasha Petrosky with Milk and Honey, which was bringing back that speakeasy idea. What always I noticed in those spaces was that when there were the bartenders were servers, servers were bartenders, and you would see different people working both positions when you would go in on different nights. So there was this kind of egalitarian feeling of a space. So going to Audrey Saunders, who famously had started going to some of these events where Sasha and Dale were showing drinks, and she ended up asking Dale if she could stage with him, work with him. And so she did. She started working events with Dale and learning from him. And they even opened a place called the Blackbird together, where they worked on the program. And Audrey just took it and ran. I think she always used that expression of get in the car and drive. And she became very notable for her position at the Bemelman's bar and the cocktails that she was putting there in this beautiful hotel bar, which ultimately led to her pairing up and partnering with Julie Reiner, Sue Federoff, Michelle Connolly, and the Cassis on the Pegu Club, which, you know, as iconic as it is, when we get to a couple of slides, you'll see how many drinks where it came from this place that were very prolific. And Audrey's style of cocktail school and going back and really training the young bartenders coming through on how to create drinks and think about their DNA and work at perfection of those drinks. For me, my big impact was seeing people having access to people like Audrey when she used to come into the Flatiron Lounge while she was opening Pegu Club, but also to Julie Reiner, who actually gave me my first cocktail shaker, and working at the Flatiron Lounge. And again, this was when I started in 2004 there. We're talking about, this was like a high volume cocktail bar, which was just kind of starting to be that way. Like it has all the looks and feel, and we had that kind of style of old-timey 40s Art Deco classic cocktails, but mixed with modern tropicals that Julie was doing. And it was busy, and this kind of was a place to kind of do both high volume and classic cocktails. And really at the time it was anyone, Julie would hire anyone, male, female, didn't matter. And then the reality was we were working much harder and making less money than we would in clubs for the same hours, where we're just pouring out of a gun vodka sodas. We were crafting and shaking. And I was very fortunate to work in this space with women like Katie Stipe. But the influence in this space we had men and women working there, and everyone had an opportunity, but it was female owned and female run. And that was, I think, a big part of why that space was so open. And Julie has continued to, support women in the industry. She opened Leyenda with Ivy Mix, my partner in Speed Rack. And so you see this kind of fostering of generations of women through leadership and mentorship, which is very valuable. And Jerry Banks, I'm going to touch upon Jerry because I found this article of where it all began, which definitely a great article to read. But I remembered I saw Jerry Banks and I was like, what happened to Jerry Banks? And she is actually still a consultant, has been for years. But I remembered when her cocktail, the Juniperativo, was on the Flatiron Lounge menu, and she would come in and it was a great drink. And, Robert Simonson makes a point. I found a really cool blog where I found this list of modern classics, and these are the ones that were put out there that were by women. And when you talk about why certain women were, you look at this list, it is very New York centric, it is very big city centric. Julie and Audrey and people who worked under them have a lot of cocktails in this space, and that was because those women run establishments. We talk about ownership now, and that because those were women run establishments, they were being interviewed, they were able to put out there and get these drinks out into the world. So there is a bit of this inequity that still exists with, I think, operating, owning in hospitality that get women on the map. So we keep exploring that, and we'll be talking a bit about that in some of our other chats during this week. So please refer back to our YouTube channel where we have all of our Women's History Month content cataloged that you can kind of talk about some of these things. But Jerry was a consultant, and I certainly felt that at certain times when being a consultant, it was a lot more tricky, especially if you weren't behind one of these big bars, you just kind of got lost in the shuffle for a bit with media. So I'm going to bring up the Drinking Like Ladies book, which is authored by Kitty and Misty. I met Kitty and Misty in 2009 at Tales of the Cocktail, and I had saw their other book that they wrote with their LUPEC chapter, Ladies United for the Preservation of Endangered Cocktails, and I saw what they were doing, was getting feminist women who worked in hospitality together to do bartending events that raised money for women's-based charities in their community. And I had just started, meeting so many women in New York, as I started to branch out of my normal rotation of people, right? The people I knew were my friends and who worked with me at Flanagan and Freeman's and Pegu, and those people, I realized my network was quite small. And when I expanded that network and started to go to other spaces, I met so many women who I didn't know. And it was quite shocking to me that they weren't, more prevalent on the scene. And so we started doing LUPEC events in New York. I started a chapter, and that led to, me and ultimately meeting Ivy Mix and kind of setting us off on our path of speed rack. Because when she got in, the timing was a little bit different. Where I had a much easier time breaking into craft, she had a much harder time. And SpeedRec was our opportunity to offer a platform using a lot of our LUPEC networks. I remember I reached out to Elba Ware to be like, we're kind of Texas, we're going to do SpeedRec, help. This has built the community that we're super proud to have today. Ever changing, ever growing. Our missions evolve with what is needed. And I think now mentorship and ownership are some of those things that we really want to tackle, and also supporting women as we come back into the space after a year, a very difficult year. But also what I love seeing is that there are, women globally really showing up in global cocktail competitions and making their mark. But not only that, women distillers and blenders who we are seeing more and more attention being paid to, these incredible women who have been doing this work, some for over 30 years, some more new, but what they do and how they contribute to their community is really important. And all of these women here exemplify that and or have been a part of some of our speed rack initiatives. So we thank them for doing what they're doing and challenging those norms. And then to the women-led advocacy, all of these groups, please check them out. Chicago Style, Focus on Health, Support Staff, Radical Exchange, Causing a Stir, Chocolate City Best, Healthy Poor. They're just some of the women-led advocacy that are working to make change and to make this industry sustainable for the workers in it, but also to keep making sure that there is equity and inclusion across the board in this industry. And so I thank you. These are just some other resources you can look into. And if you have any other questions, here are our Instagram handles. Feel free to reach out, and we hope to see you some point in the future at a live presentation of this seminar or reviewing this. And if you have any information of anyone we've missed, please let us know, because we can only keep learning and keep growing and expanding this seminar. So thank you so much.